Our last speaker for today is Carmen Wilmore, who you all know and love as one of our goat specialists on the team. And today she's going to be discussing some of the alternative forages that sheep and goats may be able to graze on, especially during drought years, which unfortunately we're kind of looking at having one this year. So very, very pertinent to right now. And Carmen, I'll let you take over.
Awesome. Okay, so like Melinda said, I'm Carmen Wilmore. I'm located here in Lincoln County, which is in South Central Idaho. I'm an extension educator for the University of Idaho. And I hope today I just give you a few ideas of alternative forages that could be applicable, especially in drought years for our sheep and goats. Hopefully my slides will go forward. Okay, there we go. So this is just the most recent 2021 Drought Monitor. So I wanted to zoom in, especially on the West, and just kind of show, I think most of us are aware of this, but we're looking at some pretty significant and in some areas very severe drought conditions for our growing and grazing season this year. And so that just kind of sets the stage for what I'm going to talk about is different considerations to be making this year as we look into our grazing season. So I'll be talking mostly about annual forages that we could use in drought years in the West. And I'll start out talking about some of the warm season grasses that could still be planted this late spring and early summer. If you still have open fields or are trying to decide what you can kind of rent or lease from other operators to put your sheep and goats on this summer and in the fall. If you are having to pull them off of allotments early this year, a few options that you could have is, kind of plan B to put them on in the fall. And then I'll also talk about a few cool season grasses that are more applicable to be planted in early spring or even late fall that would be available for grazing early in the spring. Kind of just to keep in your mind as we hopefully don't have too many drought years to come, but as things change and, our weather patterns change, we can have these kind of in our mind to consider in the future. And then I'll briefly talk about some cover crop mixes. I know one of our speakers earlier today talked a little bit about her cover crop mixes that she was grazing with sheep. So I'll just give you some broad ideas there because that's a really big topic. So if you have specific questions on what might work in your area and with the livestock that you graze, you can always shoot me an email or call my office and we can discuss those. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is forage sorghum and sorghum sudan. And so these are both sorghums, but they are different. And so I wanted to kind of discuss the commonalities, but then where there are differences. So both can be drought tolerant after they are established. They need to be established when the soil temperatures are around 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So for most of us in the Intermountain West, that would be the end of May, the first part of June. So you still have time if this is something you want to test out. You could still hopefully order some seed and get it established in your fields. But you do need good water and adequate soil moisture when it's planted to get those plants up and going. If you're really struggling for water this year or not going to have water through probably the middle of July, this would be a hard forage to get established to be able to use this year. The grazing risk for these, as far as prussic acid poisoning goes, is, higher. I guess it's higher when the plants are less than 24 inches tall. I hope that makes sense. So after they hit that 2 or 24 inches of height, they're safer to graze, except for if they're frost or any type of other stress. That's when, when the plant gets stressed, that's when that prussic acid is released. But once they're 24 inches tall, they're safer to graze. And then the toxicity of the different cultivars can change or can vary. So Depending on what cultivars are available to you, look at the toxicity dangers of those. And again, that's kind of a broader topic. So if you have questions, let me know on that one. So forage sorghum is known as a drought tolerant crop, but it is not frost tolerant, and that goes for both of these. It is adapted to more warm regions and usually don't regrow after harvest, unlike sorghum Sudan. And so these are best used in kind of a single cut or a single graze scenario. And they can be really high yielding at 15 to 30 tons per acre, but that would be in optimal growing conditions. So looking at a drought year, I would expect a lower yield than that, but still certainly would produce a lot of forage that you could harvest for hay or ensiling to use as a stockpiled feed for later in the year. But they do have that potential for prussic acid, especially in the grazing situation. So if this is something you're looking at, it would be probably more advantageous to use it in a baled or ensiled situation where you could cut that feed and have it for later in the fall if you do have to come off of your grazing allotments sooner. So sorghum Sudan is a finer stemmed, still drought tolerant, warm season grass that can grow 4 to 6 feet tall. It's better to plant 2 weeks after your corn planting would be in your area. So for us in Southern Idaho, we're definitely planting our corn right now. So probably that late May, early June time period would be good for planting sorghum Sudan in our area. You could broadcast at 40 to 50 pounds per acre or drill at a little bit less than this. And it does need to be about 2 inches to help at a soil or a planting depth of 2 inches to reach that soil moisture. So it is really important. If your soils are dry, you can even go through, do a light watering before you plant so that the moisture is already in the soil when you plant your sorghum Sudan. And then you can begin mowing or grazing at that 3 to 4 feet mark. Again, making sure that there's more than 24 inches of forage there to help lessen the risk of prussic acid poisoning. And that also encourages the roots to grow deeper and harvest more of that, deep soil moisture to keep the plant in kind of that vegetative stage. Because I think in my experience, sheep and goats don't like it. They'll eat these grass species if they aren't as fibrous. Because they are browsers, they still want something very green and vegetative to kind of be more palatable to them. So if you let these get too mature and kind of rank, you're not going to get as much intake as you would grazing at a more vegetative, less mature state. And like I think it's been mentioned throughout the day, leaving at least 4 to 6 inches of stubble will help with the optimal growth and regrowth of a lot of these varieties so that you can graze them more than once and get more utilization out of them. So each plant will produce many tillers and will regrow rapidly after that grazing or cutting, and should allow for 2 to 3 grazings or cuttings each season, which is kind of what I think you would want out of a lot of these annual situations where you could management intensively graze them throughout kind of that July, August, September season where a lot of our other grasses are really struggling until we can hopefully get some fall precipitation or winter precipitation. And so with these, there is the caution of prussic acid poisoning. So durin, which is the chemical compound which breaks down and releases that prussic acid, is lower in the sorghum Sudan grass than in the forage sorghum. So that's why it is a little safer to be grazing sorghum Sudan versus forage sorghum. However, that risk for poisoning is higher when, or the risk for poisoning is higher in the grazed forages than anything that's going to be dried or ensiled, because when it goes through that drying and ensiling process, that releases that prussic acid, so it's not present in the plant where it's going to cause harm to your livestock. So just a couple things on prussic acid poisoning. So the active compound in prussic acid, what's happening inside the animal is that is actually depriving the cells of oxygen and can lead to asphyxiation. So they have trouble breathing, right? And so durum, which is that compound, is highest in the young and shorter plants or tillers, making those especially dangerous when they're grazed or green chopped. So it can occur, the poisoning can occur very rapidly in high risk forages and can result in sudden death. And high levels of nitrogen fertilizer and manure can also raise that risk for prussic acid poisoning as the plant is growing very rapidly. But like I said a couple times now, the drying or ensiling will help it kind of release that prussic acid and reduce the amount that's present in the forage. So a couple of grazing considerations. Times to be concerned, I guess what I would say would times to be concerned about it would be regrowth from the plants shortly after a frost or a heavy rain, and when it's being grazed at less than the 24 to 30 inches. And then immediately after a killing frost. Those are kind of the big three. And I know when it's hard because in the West, sometimes we can have a killing frost in September and then warm temperatures and everything kind of comes back to life. And so I know, especially in our area here in Lincoln County, we had a really bad frost in early September last year, which kind of messed up some things. But then 2 weeks later, it was, 85, 90 degrees. And so that is kind of the caution with some of these sorghum and sorghum Sudans is when that killing frost happens and then what happens to the plant afterwards. And so you do have to be mindful and monitor the situation, remove the animals from that, from the sorghum Sudans if there is a risk for the prussic acid poisoning. And a couple of symptoms to look for. Early symptoms would be excitement, labored breathing. As the poisoning does progress, you'll see some staggering, trembling muscles, just kind of as their body just starts to struggle with the respiratory failure. Their mucous membranes can turn blue. And then in some situations, sorry about that. I think someone will answer that. Yep. Chronic poisoning can have a sublethal dose over time, causing loss of nerve function. And so that's where they have kind of a constant exposure to the prussic acid poisoning. So you can certainly graze these. I'll get to it later, but I would recommend if you do, maybe not having a monoculture, but including them in some type of cover crop grazing mix so they're not the only forage source available. So next I'll talk a little bit about ryegrass and cereal rye. So ryegrass has annual and perennial varieties and is not as drought tolerant as cereal rye. It can be used in drought situations if it's established early, just knowing that it's not going to recover as quickly as some of the other varieties if it is drought stressed. Whereas cereal rye is more cold and drought tolerant and can produce more dry matter than wheat and some of the other cereals, especially in poor, dry, droughty soils. So cereal rye is a cool season annual cereal grain. It can be mixed with legumes, grasses, and other cereal grains in some type of cover crop mix. Did I have a question? Okay. And it can also be seeded in late fall if you have the water. I've had quite a few people kind of looking at cereal rye as a cover crop that they could plant in the fall and then have it come up in early spring and have some early grazing in late March, April before they go out on allotments. And I think it definitely has some use there. It's something that I want to look at in the future and seeing how it does in our different environments. It can outperform other cover crops in really poor soils. So if you have some fields that don't perform well with other cereal grains, this is definitely one to test out, and it does really good in our cool temperatures. So I know, especially in some of our mountain areas, this would be one that would probably do well there. It is tall and quicker growing than wheat. And this is something that I thought was really interesting, to especially when I think about drought in the West and how windy it can be in our areas, is it can serve as a bit of a windbreak and help trap some of that winter precipitation. But also, when I think of a windbreak, and it could help keep your soil where it is in our dry, windy type of environment that we can have here in the summer. So just another consideration, another use of it there as well if you're concerned about soil health. It can resume growth quickly in the spring, and it also ties up a lot of soil nitrogen. So it can be a nitrogen or a nitrate accumulator. So that's one thing to keep in mind when you are grazing it, is to test it for nitrates. So as far as establishing it, it does prefer light, loamy, or sandy soils, and will germinate even in a fairly dry soil. So that's another really good thing about it as far as we're looking in drought conditions. It also will grow in heavy clays and poorly drained soils. It is more sensitive to seeding depth than some of our other cereals, so you cannot plant deeper than 2 inches because it does need to be able to come up pretty quickly and start growing. That's also why it is a little easier to establish. If drilling for a forage rate, it'd be 60 to 120 pounds an acre, and if you're broadcasting, a little higher than that. So utilization, mature rye isn't very palatable and can provide poor quality forage. So if you are using this, definitely graze it or cut it for hay before it gets too mature. And I also was talking to someone, and they said they had concerns about cereal rye being very palatable to sheep. And I think especially if you let it get too mature, they're probably not really going to be very interested in it. So keep an eye on it. Don't let it get too rank and too fibrous. You could make high quality hay when cut at the boot stage, and it should still be pretty palatable at that stage, especially as a hay. You can also extend the grazing season by putting this in late fall and then having it in early spring when it's still going to be in a very green vegetative state. It can tolerate pretty heavy fall grazing and then still have spring growth. So if that's something that you're looking and needing for your flocks, this could be a good utilization or a good forage option for you. And then it's not recommended to plant prior to a grain crop because it is very hard to get rid of. So if you're planting this and then thinking you could go in with spring wheat or spring barley, I would maybe consider either a different crop to plant into it, or a different, cover crop or a different grazing crop than this, because it is difficult to kill and get out of your fields. And so it can contaminate your next crop that you follow it with. So a little bit about annual cereals. They should be planted in the spring, and they need about 6 to 8 weeks of cold temperatures to become well established. So for our area, that would usually be planting the first week of April, so that they have time to establish and kind of do well. This would be our forage oats, forage barley, and winter wheat. And triticale, we've done some grazing, well, I guess kind of some grazing studies, but with mechanical removal without actual livestock. We've seen that triticale establishes really well and has high yields, but it doesn't do well in a season-long grazing. So once things get hot and it kind of dries out a little, it doesn't come back as well as some of our other forage species. So it's good if you need some spring forage or want to cut it for hay, but maybe not something that's going to carry on through the fall.
Okay. Do we need anything else today?
So with talking about the annual cereals and the rye grasses, I need to also talk a little bit about nitrate poisoning.
Okay.
So under normal circumstances, nitrate is converted to ammonia and bacterial protein, and there is little buildup in the plant. That's in the perfect world. It goes from forage nitrate to nitrite, ammonia, and then protein. And that's all happening in the rumen when that forage is consumed. But when there's higher amounts of nitrate in the forage that our livestock is consuming, there can become an accumulation of nitrate in the rumen, then can be converted to ammonia in the microbial protein. So there's a buildup of nitrate from the nitrate that they're consuming. And this all has to do with the level of consumption and also the level of the microbes in the rumen that can break down that nitrate. And so if they don't have the right microbes and they're not in high enough quantities, that's when you kind of get a buildup. And so as that nitrite, it has to go somewhere, so the blood will absorb it and it will convert hemoglobin to methemoglobin, which then is unable to transport oxygen. And that's why we have issues with nitrate poisoning, because our animals die from lack of oxygen. And so another way to look at this is when you have that high nitrate forage, this is kind of what's happening in the rumen, where it's being converted to ammonia and where that excess nitrate goes. So if there's buildup of nitrates in the rumen, that's what kind of leads to this nitrate poisoning of our ruminant livestock. And so this is a lot of research, I guess some research has been done with this in cattle. There's not a ton that has been done in sheep and goats, I'll admit that, because I looked for it for like a week now. But from what I can understand, the same thing is happening in our sheep and goats. Sheep are a little more tolerant to it. Goats, I think, still lie in the same category as cattle as far as their tolerance. But one thing to know is that they can acclimate to, excuse me, I'm gonna have to cough here for one. So they can acclimate to high nitrate forages if they are they build up their tolerance. So they have to give the microbial population in their rumen time to build up the right, I guess, microbes to break down that excess nitrite. And so that takes time. And so if you put them on a forage that's very high in nitrates on an empty stomach, they're not going to have the time to build up their tolerance. And that's where you get poisoning concerns. Move on to my next slide. And so nitrate accumulation in the forages. So the plant tissues will accumulate these during the night when photosynthesis is inactive. So that also peaks in the morning, which is another thing when you are putting your livestock onto a new pasture, a new field where you're concerned about this. Moving them in the afternoon when that plant has had time to kind of photosynthesize the nitrate into protein, that will also help with any, poisoning concerns. So it's quickly converted to protein as it has that sunlight energy. And in some cases, the roots also accumulate nitrate faster than the plant can convert the nitrate to protein. And other things that impact this is when the plant undergoes any stress, like drought, and it's unable to convert that nitrate to the protein. So a couple of things that can stress the plant in these situations would be hail, frost, long cool spells, drought, pest, disease, herbicides, and shade. And so what's happening in these drought situations is the drought causes the plant stomata to close in order to conserve that water. But in closing that stomata, it also restricts the carbon dioxide available to fuel the photosynthesis and growth stops. And so that's another way that it's being built up in plants. So especially looking at a drought year, this can happen in all plants. It's just kind of more well known in our annual cereals because they are so fast growing. It's just one of those things, kind of one of those caveats to having a fast growing plant. So this is feeding guidelines for livestock. If you are going to be grazing any of these forages, the annual cereal forages, you can take a field sample. Usually I have people, I've done lab tests, I guess I'd say, in the quick test. If you have an extension office in your area that is trained and has the quick test available, I usually tell people to walk through their field and grab about 10 plants, and I want the root, the whole plant. And I can do a quick test on those and tell you if there are nitrates present or not. And then usually I will have them do the same thing, go out and grab at least 10 samples from the field. And I'll take a composite of that and have our lab run it as well, so we can get a number on it and know where they're at as far as safety for grazing. And so the biggest thing is different labs will report these in different ways. So they can sometimes be reported as nitrate nitrogen. Sometimes they're reported as nitrogen or nitrate. They can be reported on parts per million or milligrams per milliliter, I believe is the other one. So I guess the base of the story is different labs will report them differently. So ask your lab, okay, what does this really mean? Is it safe? Because they'll also have their own guidelines. This is a pretty basic guideline. This is the one that I use to make my recommendations, but I always look at what lab the results are coming from and what guideline they use. So you can't just always say if it's less than 1,000, it's fine, because they might be reporting it on a totally different scale and it might actually be dangerous to graze at that level. So that would be my biggest kind of advice if you're testing for nitrates, is to work with your lab. And also you can certainly consult with your extension agent in your area, or call me or Melinda, and we can look it over with you as well. But as far as the general guidelines, anything less than 1,000 parts per million nitrate nitrogen is generally safe under all conditions. 1,000 to 2,000 is safe for most animals, but can be hazardous to pregnant and young animals. And it can certainly cause abortions at this level, as it is, even at that level, it can reduce their oxygen carrying capacity in their blood, which is why it can cause abortions, because there's not enough oxygen getting to that fetus. Between 2,000 to 4,000, limit the amount to half of the total dry ration. And so that's if it's being fed. If it's being grazed, there is some research that thinks that grazing, they can actually consume a little higher amount of that because they have acclimated to it. So it kind of also depends on how the forage is being consumed. And then over 4,000 would be toxic and not recommended to feed. So a couple of nitrate toxicity symptoms. Signs of early or chronic toxicity would be watery eyes, reduced appetite, and milk production, kind of an unthrifty appearance, weight loss, night blindness, and like I said, the abortions. Signs of acute toxicity would be an accelerated pulse rate, labored breathing, muscle tremors, weakness, cyanosis, and death. So just a couple last slides here. I'll talk a little bit about cover crop mixes in these situations. They can provide a lot of diversity. You could include some of these cereals that I've talked about, legumes, brassicas, and our warm season grasses. They should be managed to be grazed very intensively to ensure that the plants don't reach a maturity where your palatability would be limited. And so I'm really glad that we had a speaker already talk about how to kind of management intensively graze. And that's a great partnership with some of these cover crop mixes, because you can get a lot of utilization out of them when they're grazed effectively. And depending on the species, if you're not able to graze them fast enough, they can be cut and baled. But with some of the wetter species, having in the mix a hay wedge would be a better route and could use to cut the nitrate issue if toxicity has occurred. Just cutting hay or cutting some of these annual grasses and cereals will not get rid of the nitrates. whatever you cut it at is what it's going to be fed at if it's fed as a hay. If it is ensiled, it can reduce the nitrate levels, because in that ensiling process, that helps kind of process some of the nitrates out of the forage, but definitely retest after the ensiling so you know what you're actually feeding. So a couple other ideas of things to add into your mixes that I thought I would mention that are they are able to grow in the West, and I have a chart that NRCS is putting together if you guys are interested in looking at some more of these. But some other ideas are millet, brown flax, chicory, grazing corns, mustard, buckwheat, sunflower, turnips, radishes, and cowpeas. And I know our first speaker talked about this, but sunflower is actually something that I've had people be like, oh, they wouldn't eat that. But if you have sheep and goats, you probably have seen them eat sunflowers and some of these other things. So they probably will at least taste it and try it out. And then you'll be able to tell if they're going to eat it very much. But especially in a mix, when there's enough diversity, they should be able to pick and choose with what suits their palate, and they'll consume a good portion of that. So just a couple final thoughts since we're running out of time. Sorghums are not frost tolerant, and so you do have to be mindful of the prussic acid poisoning with those. Sheep can be more resistant to nitrate poisoning, but certainly still should be testing your forages for nitrates if you're concerned. Ensiling or haying of forages will reduce the prussic acid present when consumed, but will not change the nitrate levels. Haying will not change nitrate levels at all. Ensiling can lessen them a little bit, but not a lot at the same time. So when planning a cover crop mix, consider the competitiveness of your certain species and planting dates. And the big thing there is your warm seasons like sorghum and Sorghum Sudan. They need to be planted kind of the late May, early June time period. If you try and plant them in April with some of the other annual cereals, they're not going to establish very well because the temperatures just aren't right at that time period for them. And then graze or cut cover crops to keep them in that vegetative state so they don't get too mature and become unpalatable. So I guess, do I have any questions?